I'm Dave. I run a surfboard repair shop in LA, and today I'm going to run you through how to restore a vintage Dewey Weber surfboard. To start, I clean the board using a razor blade and acetone. You don't want to use a brand new razor blade just because they're so sharp that sometimes they will scratch the surface of the board underneath the wax when you're getting that off and cleaning it up. From what I can tell from this board, I think it was probably made in the 1960s. When restoring a vintage board, it's definitely important to take note of any original markings, which include signature by the shaper, any kind of logos from when it was originally made. You want to keep all that intact because it definitely affects the authenticity of the surfboard. Delamination occurs when heat or stress or anything else separates the fiberglass from the foam core of the surfboard. Technique for delaminations is pretty easy. I'll kind of knock on the board. If it sounds like you're hitting a countertop, that's usually a good sound. If it sounds kind of like a dull thud or like cardboard, that's a sure sign that it's delaminated. If the fiberglass isn't adhered well to the foam underneath, there's a lot of flexing happening. If you, let's say, fall on a wave or drop in late on a wave and your feet land where a delamination is, you're much more likely to snap the board in half. Next, I'll check the board for dings. Dings are any crack in the fiberglass of the surfboard. I determine what tool I'm going to use based on the severity of the ding. But I generally start with any kind of abrasive or sanding tool, usually a grinding disc or some kind of sandpaper. Fourth step is generally filling any dings that are dented all the way into the foam of the surfboard. To fill dings, I use Q-Cell and laminating resin. I generally prefer to mix a lot of Q-Cell into the resin and get it almost a consistency of peanut butter or thicker. The only dings that don't require filling is where the integrity or the shape or the outline of the surfboard isn't changed. So this board looks like it had been previously repaired. Someone attempted to repair this delamination before. That's what all these spots are on the top of the board. And when I pulled that flap up, all that resin pulled out of the foam, but it stayed adhered to the flap of fiberglass. I'm removing these hanging pieces of resin because I'm using filler on the board, and that's going to fill those holes, so it won't fit back in. I'm mixing up resin and Q-Cell. This is forming a kind of paste, and when it cures, it forms a chemical bond between that flap of fiberglass and the foam core of the surfboard. So I'm applying this in between those two layers. I'm kind of getting rid of any of the foam that's stuck to this panel of fiberglass, and what that's going to do is enable that fiberglass to lay more flush against the foam core of the surfboard. So right here I'm using 8 crate foam. I'm putting that on the board because in the next step we're going to lay some wood over the top of the surfboard and then use clamps to fasten that down, and that adheres this flap back to the surface of the foam. What I'm doing now is sanding down some of this resin that squeezed through the cracks when I clamped the flap down. The filler that I used isn't necessarily waterproof, it's actually porous. And so fiberglass and resin, once applied to the fiberglass, creates a waterproof barrier. This goes over your filler. In this case, we're not going to do fiberglass over the entire top of the board because that would make it too heavy. It generally takes between 1 and 3 hours for your resin to cure, whether it's a hot coat or a lamination. You can speed it up by adding more resin, but you're going to get not a very good cure, so you got to stick to the ratios. Sixth step, sanding or feathering the edges of that fiberglass back down into the regular board. The purpose of feathering your fiberglass patches is aesthetic as well as functional. If you have a hard square patch, that could cause or to fracture along that flat edge if it's wide enough. After that would be applying your hot coat resin, as some people call it. A hot coat is laminating resin mixed with a chemical additive called surfacing agent. And what that is wax. It rises to the top of the resin as it sets, and then it allows you to sand it with sandpaper. On the top of the board, the damage is so extensive that I'm just going to do one hot coat over the entire surfboard. On the bottom, the damage looks a lot less extensive, so I'm just going to focus on the specific areas that need attention rather than spending the time doing the entire bottom of the board. The 8th step is sanding those areas that you were working on. I use a 60 grit sanding disc. That's the lowest or most coarse sandpaper I use when I'm grinding my lamination. After I do my hot coat, I'm actually doing the fine sanding. I start with 120 grit, move to 220, 350. Start wet sanding at 400, then up to 600, and then generally you'd be done at 600 for a sanded finish. But if you're doing a polished finish like this, you go from 600 to 800 to 1200. This board took me about 3 hours to sand. That's a pretty standard amount of time for a job like this. Skipping grits would save time, but you would not come out with a good finish. It's important to spend the time on each grit if you want your board to come out looking pristine. It's time to polish the board. So you grab your polishing compound and a buffing wheel and polish the board up. Polishing the board, it's purely aesthetic. That's how you're going to get that mirror finish on a surfboard. Dewey Weber was one of the most famous and influential surfboard shapers of his time. When I first got the board, I paid around $300 for it. In its restored condition, I would estimate that this board's worth somewhere around $1,000. This restoration was super satisfying and fun to work on. I'm really excited to get this board back out and go surf. Now that the board is fixed, it'll last a lifetime if taken care of correctly.